an updated interest-based account in brackets monotropism theory close brackets a developmental model for demand avoidance phenomena, or otherwise known as pathological demand avoidance. I'm just going to be calling it PDA in this talk for ease of reference. I'm Mr. Richard Woods. I'm a PhD student at London South Bank University, and this is a recording that I'm done of a talk I delivered in Oslo, in Norway, on the 1st November 2019. So, yeah, I was diagnosed as autistic in 2012. I prefer demand avoidance phenomena as a name for PDA to, which I'll kind of explain later. I do meet Elizabeth Newton's behaviour profile, but I don't think that particularly means much. I was an independent scholar at the time, but I'm now a PhD student at London South Bank University, hence why the logo's on the slides. I'm a lateral thinker, not a longitudinal. I do have quite an extensive portfolio on PDA. So, yeah, cheap plug for Autism Policy and Practice, which is an open access autistic good practice journal. You can find out through the link here. So, yeah, I have written many articles and book chapters, delivered conference talks on various topics such as scientific issues with PDA and what does a neutral ethical position of PDA look like. I have taught and delivered training postgraduate level and to other people on PDA. And I am doing a PhD at London South Bank University under Eddie Chaplin and David Milting, and I did start in September 2020. So this talk is covering monotropism autism theory. So yeah, so this was a study that I did back in late 2019. It's replicated in a study by Nick Chown, who analysed the screening tools and diagnostic tools for the broad autism phenotype and autistic traits to see if any of the items were specific to either of those two constructs. His results suggested that both broad autism phenotype and autistic traits are a result of kind of word games, and that these constructs lack specificity. By what Nicholas Chown means by word games is that people just assumed a definition for them when talking about them. They were not clearly defined originally. So, yeah, it's also argued within the PDA literature that PDA falls under the broad autism phenotype by Judy Eaton in her book, 2019 book. So, I replicated this study but with PDA tools, and what I found was that there's none of the items assessed in the tools included in the study were specific, and I found that generally the items in those tools can be grouped into three themes. One of them was a small number of them were related to criminal behaviour, but the two main groupings were one was of features that people use to exert their self-agency when stressed, and another one is the second one, which is the features being assessed by those items are representative of trauma and or distress. So yeah, this is talking more about the kind of logic behind this kind of study. So it's argued in the PDA literature that PDA has no features specific to it. So basically what that means is that a feature that some people think is PDA can be seen in other features. So it's been noted in PDA literature that there are signs of PDA in Hans Asperger's case studies. I have recently kind of noted it in unpublished research that there are signs of PDA in Kanner's descriptions of autism. I think that I've already kind of discussed this. So yeah, within the kind of PDA literature, there is substantial dislike for the pathological descriptor of PDA. A lot of people think it's kind of demeaning and derogatory, and generally just an awful term. So there's substantial demand to change its name in the literature. So it's one reason why I prefer calling it demand avoidance phenomena, because it's a neutral term and it kind of validates the lived experience of PDA by saying there is something distinct going on. With PDA generally there's no comparative evidence to suggest what PDA is, and ethically we should be presenting a balance and a balanced perspective on PDA should be presented. So this is a quote from Judy Eaton's 2018 book. So professionals and teams working with children need to become aware of the ways in which girls can mask difficulties and need to move away from using DSM as a Bible, stating that someone does not fulfill criteria when these criteria are based on a malpresentation of a disorder is short-sighted extreme. I kind of generally echo this kind of sentiment, but I also think it's applicable to um, working and diagnosing and theorizing PDA. Just because a bunch of people think PDA might be seen in autistic persons and presented a certain way in autistic persons does not mean that PDA cannot be presented in a different way to these biased views on PDA as a form of autism. So yeah, that's why I said down here, such sentiments are equally applicable to those dogmatically favouring PDA as a form of autism. So yeah, this is a quote from validating or the revalidate. Well, it's not even validated. That's because the paper actually says they actually being validated to have a cutoff. So this is from the revising the DISCO PDA questions. So yeah, one of the strengths of the current study was that the data used were collected in 2010 or earlier, for the most part prior to the large peak in interest in PDA, such as it is likely that clinicians were not particularly on the lookout for PDA features in the cases. It was possible to get an honest and unbiased picture of the features of PDA in this sample. What this tells us is that the campaign to get PDA recognised forms of autism probably creates a source of bias. I would just say that it does. It also kind of suggested that those who did this research, who viewed PDA as part of the autism, thought that they were getting an unbiased and accurate view of PDA in their research, but I would point out it's nonsense because they've prematurely assumed PDA as part of the autism. So, but probably digressing. Moving on to the main subject of this talk, which is monotropism theory and how it can be used to explain PDA in autistic persons, because I would point out that there's probably a good case that PDA is not specific to autism, and I would point to literature and where in literature that backs it up, but I'm digressing again. So yeah, monotropism 101. So attention is a scarce resource. There's competition between different interests for our attention. So any one particular time. So an interest is anything that kind of gains our attention, from sensory stimuli to thoughts or emotions. And each person can only process a certain amount of attention resource at any one time. And there's a kind of continuum of perceiving attention. So at one end there's monotropism, and the other end there's polytropism. So autistic persons tend to be monotropic, and non-autistic persons tend to be polytropic. So monotropic is there's one attention tunnel, and polytropic there's two attention tunnels. But that how the attention resource interacts in those attention tunnels is quite interesting, which I'll cover next. So attention tunnels are made out of attention resource, and in monotropism there's a central attention tunnel where the entire attention resource is processed and used at any one given point. While in polytropism there are many different attention tunnels, and in polytropism the attention tunnels are kind of more the attention resource is more equally distributed between the different attention tunnels that are present. So yeah, when you have a single attention tunnel in a monotropic cognitive style, the interests are processed sequentially in order of importance. What this means is that we can have intense sensations, and it can lead to kind of binary, kind of black and white kind of thinking. But also when information is not being interacted with attention resource, it tends to be blocked from our awareness. So due to having more attention resource being acting on any one particular interest, it kind of needs a kind of stronger impression on subconscious, which means it's kind of more likely to filter through into our subconscious and more likely to kind of reinitiate attention tunnels around it. But when you only have one attention tunnel, it can be more difficult to restart attention tunnel because when you have multiple attention tunnels at any one time, if one attention tunnel is broken, your attention resource still being processed and used in the other attention tunnel, so it's a lot more easy to kind of recreate another one and share your attention more equally. So yeah, it's argued theoretically that monotropism is as strong as autism theory. It kind of helps that most of the autism theory is a bit naff, but I'm again digressing. At the time of this talk 3 years ago, there was no empirical research to support monotropism, which is still technically the case. But there are two ongoing studies, empirical studies, one which I'm collaborating on, which is validating a self-report measure for monotropism. There are a few qualitative studies supporting monotropism, and I would suggest that the Storytell research into PDA and intolerance uncertainty supports monotropism. And just pointing out that Wen Lawson is a leading monotropism expert. I'm not quite sure why I mentioned that, but yeah. So for these are the core readings for monotropism. So this is the original article by Diana Marie, Wen Lawson, and Mike Lesser. The Passionate Mind is Wen Lawson's 2011 book. And this is an encyclopedia essay by Diana Murray, and this is an essay by Fergus Murray, who's Diana Murray's son and now successor, because Diana unfortunately died last year. And Fergus has now put up a new website called monotropism.com, I think, or monotropism.org. But yeah, this is all open access, so anyone can access this article by Fergus, and this is a pretty good introduction to monotropism. So yeah, logically progressing monotropism theory along, and we're going to be covering kind of flow states, clumping, and biolooping. So this is from an article by Andy McDonald and Damien Milton. So a flow state is an optimal experience that is beneficial to our well-being and happiness, and it's experience when a person is deeply involved in activity and nothing else seems to matter. Flow states can happen in social interactions, and flow states can provide stability and escape from anxiety. So such activities that engage in flow states can become compulsive and addictive. So when you enter in a flow state, especially on especially certain kind of activities, they can be kind of aversive to kind of outside life, or can be aversive things. So if you're kind of entering a flow state gambling, and you have a kind of gambling problem, that's not particularly useful. But also, if you're kind of entering flow states around like gaming and stuff, it's not necessarily helpful for getting on with a kind of ordinary life. And I'm kind of going off on topics a tangent a bit there. So yeah, the opposite to a flow state is when the attention resource doesn't flow, so it kind of clumps together, and that can lead to a person becoming stuck or not processing information efficiently. Because if the attention resource is blocked, the attention channel isn't really flowing and operating correctly. So and it can be problematic to for another person to kind of move on and it's kind of process information when it's kind of clumping. So you have something called biolooping. So when a person's mental state, it's basically how a person's mental state over time can affect their physical health, and kind of vice versa. So a person's physical health can impact their mental health, and so if a person is thinking they're ill, they can kind of make themselves ill. While if a person is kind of calm and kind of happy thinking they're well, they can kind of impact their kind of physical health. So an example kind of given by Ian Hacking is kind of yoga. So moving on from that, what I have done in my logical progression of monotropism theory is kind of use certain kind of terms to describe certain features, and this kind of it's not even just expressions, I think it is the correct one. So for example, N kind of means attention resource. So A is for anxiety, F is for flow state, so that's duration and intensity of a flow state. So R is a reservoir, so that's basically the amount of stored attention resource a person has at any one particular moment. Because obviously, when you're using attention autonomous, you're depleting your reservoir value. So you need to have a way of giving you more attention resource and adding to that. So that's where flow states come in. So when you enter in a flow state, it creates attention resource, but it also kind of helps reduce anxiety, which is quite useful. So I was created C for capacity value. So that is the amount of attention resource that is available for use after automatic cognitive process. So just being alive and having attention tunnel absorbs attention resource. So just forming the attention tunnel and just operating uses attention resource up. So that's kind of just processing your sensory stimuli and kind of automatic intrusive thoughts and stuff. So, for example, if you're anxious, that will be often be an intrusive thought, or an intrusive interest, and that will deplete the attention resource that you can use for kind of day-to-day activities or kind of active kind of consciously processing stuff. So, what that kind of means is the more flow states you have, the more attention resource you have, and kind of lower anxiety. The more the more flow states you have, the more capacity you have, because obviously your anxiety is lower, because when you're anxious, it will automatically just deplete attention resource before you can actually use anything with that attention resource on. So what it also means is the more flow states you have, the more stored attention resource you have. So yeah, this example from the PDA literature from Ruth Fillers and Phil Christie's 2019 book, but it is also in their previous kind of work on PDA. So what they have is they present you with two dials. So you have the first one is a person's tolerances to demands, and the second one is a person's levels of experience demand. So the idea is that over time, in different situations, a person's anxiety will change, so their tolerance levels will raise and decrease. So the more anxious they are, the lower their tolerance levels are. So their tolerance level is inversely proportional to their anxiety levels. So what you are trying to do is you're trying to match your demands and expectations of persons to their tolerance levels. So you're trying to not exceed the person's basically capacity to match demands being placed upon them. So the idea is that you match your kind of demands and expectations to their tolerance levels at any one time. What I would argue in the monotropism theory is that the person's tolerance levels is literally their capacitance level. So because the higher the anxiety levels, the lower the capacity value is, so therefore the lower the demands they can take any one particular time. Talking more about monotropism and anxiety. So all humans and animals need to have stability. Points of interest can be stability points. So when you have a black and white cognitive style, you tend to either be kind of certain or uncertain about particular interest or a particular topic. So, but when we are in a flow state, if these flow states can be linked to things that we're passionate about or particularly find interesting. But when you're in a flow state, the anxiety or source of anxiety can be occluded and our anxiety levels can decrease. So you can do case studies with this. So if you give someone a heart rate monitor and you allow them to engage in activities they enter a flow state in, you'll tend to find their heart rates decrease. So when you're entering a flow state and it's kind of reducing anxiety, it can become a fixed point and therefore a source of stability in our lives. So because persons tend to engage with subjects or interests that we're passionate about, but we can also engage with interests that we're not necessarily passionate about or we are just disinterested in. But it tends to take a substantial amount of attention resource to interact with, and that means that we can quickly go through our reservoir values, engaging in things that we're not particularly interested in. I'd also point out that monotropic cognitive style can explain autistic person's social communication issues. So when you think about the sensory information being given off in social communication and social interactions, you're giving off kind of verbal kind of words, and also not only the words, it's also kind of the tone and pitch, and can kind of give information away towards kind of person's mental state and kind of emotions and kind of intent around the language, what they're conveying. You also got the body language. You have body language, facial expressions, and kind of body posture, and if they gesticulate a lot, which I tend to do when talking. So I am kind of waving my hands around while doing this talk, just gesticulating a lot to kind of express a point, but you obviously don't see it, which is a bit of a tangent. But what this means is that when you have more monotropic cognitive style, when you're on the attention tunnel, and you're processing sensory information sequentially, and you're having lots of sensory information which is transient over time, changing quite rapidly, and you're processing it sequentially, it can be very overwhelming, and because you're basically you can skip different bits of sensory information from different senses. So from one moment you can be processing kind of the verbal information, then skip to kind of the visual information, and it can be very hard to keep up with. It can be quite disorientating, and it can consume quite a lot of attention resource because you're constantly switching over. It's one reason why a lot of autistic people tend to focus on the words that's being said, or just one of the sensory stimuli when they kind of interact socially. For example, when I'm interacting socially with other people, I'll tend to focus on what's being said, the words. So I often tilt my head to one side to block out it's basically to block out the sensory stimuli. Um, um, but it also explains why polytropic cognitive style can deal with social interactions a lot more better, because if you're got multiple attention tones open, you can process the sensory stimuli, the different sensory stimuli simultaneously. So yeah, moving back up to monotropism, anxiety, and autistic people. So when you have no attention resource, the attention tone just ends because it's literally made out of attention resource. So what that means is that when you have no attention tones present, an autistic person or anyone with monotropic cognitive style can just lose control because they can go into meltdowns, have shutdowns or panic attacks. But so autistic persons will tend to have kind of high anxiety levels, partly due to monotropic cognitive style, but also because we don't reliably we don't have the same kind of fixed points as other people. Because I would point out that if you're in a minority group, as autistic people are, because tend to be like 1 to 2% of the population, and a lot of autistic people don't particularly care or are not interested in non-autistic social norms. We need to have different fixed points in life, different stability points, because if you're in a majority and you're polytropic, you will tend to more often, more reliably, more consistently be able to have predictable social interactions and process them a lot less adversely compared to non-autistic people do. So I'd argue that a lot for non-autistic people, that often their fixed points and their flow states are from the normal regular social interactions and engaging in topics they're particularly passionate about. What this means is that non-autistic people tend to benefit from having overall lower anxiety levels and higher reservoir values of attention resource compared to the two autistic people. So yeah, non-autistic person's stability largely tends to come from understanding non-autistic social interactions and being able to rely on them consistently. So it's an example. So for an autistic person, if their fixed point is a breakfast routine that allows the person to function during the day. So, for example, an autistic person is entering a focus state from having a fixed routine, from having breakfast at the same time, the same bowl, same breakfast cereal, same kind of type of milk and stuff. And they have that all the time, every day, 365 days a year. That would be a source of disability. So by entering a flow state in it, they will be generating enough attention resource to allow them to get through the day by having the retention resource and the reservoir values kind of sufficiently high. So that fixed point can be explained from monotropism theory. But if you're having regularly low levels of low kind of reservoirs of attention resource, and your capacity values are often lower compared to non-autistic people, it can lead to kind of person having high anxiety overall and experiencing trauma. Because if you're regularly dropping out of attention times being disrupted and breaking, you're often kind of having kind of panic attacks or kind of blackouts or kind of freezing the stuff over. That is often an unpleasant experience, especially if you're frequently having such sensations. So it's also possible for non-autistic persons to have inconsistent social interactions and find certain anxiety, find certain social interactions anxiety breaking. So this is a quote from Fiddler and Chris 2019 from page 140. So some staff also find it anxiety breaking to spend extended periods of time with another person who is anxious and has mood swings. And this group of pupils can be very intense to work with, which is tiring. So what I'm trying to point out here is it's essentially what it says on the tin. This is me also putting at the bottom, is that some anxiety kind of often described in the PDA literature can be explained by masking, as noted by Irvin Goffman. So yeah, there is some research to suggest that PDA caregivers have higher anxiety levels than caregivers of autistic children or those with conduct disorder, and there tends to be a correlation between parents with high anxiety levels and children with high anxiety levels. So just other things to be kind of mindful of when considering anxiety in PDA. So yeah, this is an example from Steph's Two Girls from our website. So yeah, so to quote it, for years now, Sasha has controlled the music in the car, and we have one CD on repeat for weeks or months at a time. From any one CD, there's usually only a handful of songs at most which can be selected. I think I've become immune to repetition, but I'm sure others would find it unbearable if they joined us regularly on their car journey. So it's become apparent in the last few days that Sasha now needs to listen to certain songs at a certain time in the journey. So what I would argue under a monotropic theory lens is that basically Sasha in this case study would be entering a flow state with these particular songs, and they're now just part of who she is. And like it's this routine is just part of who she is. But what she's getting in from entering the flow state is the flow state is giving her enough attention resource to both very surviving capacity value to basically function in a day or to help function in a day. So yeah, this is a developmental model by Ruth Howard from 2017. It's a sensory over-responsivity response developmental model is what the source stands for. So that sensory over-responsivity here and neurological differences can kind of interact with kind of missed developmental opportunities and challenging situations. These kind of delayed environment, socialization issues, kind of presentation consequences, so kind of self-soothing, kind of low-level motor, assistance to sameness, special interests, or high focus and or ability, socialization differences, avoidance coping strategies, and kind of anxiety and tolerance of uncertainty. These all kind of interact with each other. And what it notices is that the environment can interact in all these different ways and kind of lead to how a person kind of have sensory responsivity and how they kind of see the world through kind of neurological differences and stuff. So yeah, I'd point out they could probably adapt to have autistic sensory under-responsivity and for monotropism. The hand one is also applicable to trauma-based developmental delays, and neurological differences can be from during pregnancy kind of trauma experiences. So yeah, moving on, monotropism uses an embodied mind environment feedback and increases from birth, and it uses mechanisms for bi-looping and looping effects. So yeah, more about it. So it's compatible with Luke Bearden's kind of word equation for autism plus environment equals outcome. So what's the feature or behavior being expressed by the autistic person is related to the autism spiking profile and the environment they're in at any particular given time. It's also kind of based on the kind of environment of double empathy problem and kind of goodness of fit. And thus this model is transactional in nature. So it's depending on how the environment is interacting with the person and vice versa. And what it talks about is about matching the environment as much as possible to the needs and of the individual in one time. So yeah, the preschool autism communication trial, or PACT for sure, is an intervention. I don't like that term intervention, but basically what happens is that a caregiver is trained to match up their actions with their infant's actions at any one time. So it's about matching the caregiver's behaviours to the needs of their infant at any one particular time, and making that as a synchronous process as much as possible. So what they found is if you train caregivers to synchronise their actions with their child as much as possible, that you can kind of on kind of autism severity measures or tools, you can have a lower scoring of autistic children who have experienced PACT, basically, of them from their caregivers when they were younger, when they were infants. So yeah, so basically it shows a sustained reduction in severity of autism symptoms. It doesn't cure autism. I should be quite clear about that. I'm talking about from a medical model perspective. I don't like the medical model per se. Moving back to monotropism. So what happens is over time is that these kind of peaks kind of basically form, which are kind of very dense, kind of really tightly packed connections, but they're kind of very sparsely kind of connected, which contrasts quite a lot with polytropism, which has so yeah, with polytropism, you have lower, less densely packed peaks, which are all kind of interconnected with fuzzy boundaries and stuff. While with so going forward, we're back to monotropism peaks. They are quite distinct boundaries, but you can build connections between the peaks. But these connections will be fewer, and kind of the peaks will be more clearly defined. It kind of explains why autistic people can have the spiky profile and quite distinct spiky profile compared to non-autistic people. So what happens is the more synchronized the environment is for autistic person interests, the more opportunities we have to enter flow states. The more opportunities an autistic person will have to enter flow states, and we'll tend to have multiple fixed points instead of kind of one, and therefore have higher severity values. So the activities that are fixed points over time can internalize and become part of our identity. So, for example, Harry Thompson in his 2019 book would talk about how he would always respond to theirs. And I point out like my bad jokes. So part of me is I just tend to always make bad jokes. You might have noticed the word puns at the top of the slides in red and capital. So for example, peak district and of peak interest. Yeah, and kind of a snug fit at the top. Kind of, I'm talking about kind of matching the environment to the person's kind of needs and stuff. So yeah, so more autistic person's external environment is matched to their interests, the more densely connected the peaks will be, and likewise more external connections between the peaks. But the converse of this is if we experience kind of psychological trauma, it can cause the kind of peaks to become disconnected and severed, and the peaks themselves can be shattered as well, which isn't particularly helpful. And the reason I'm saying this is because anecdotally, autistic persons can lose a sense of self from trauma, and that our special interests can change over time. So when I suffered quite substantial psychological trauma in several years ago, my special interest changed from nuclear-based technology, particularly fission-based stuff, to autism and then later PDA. Primarily to make sense of what I was going through. But yeah, I go probably on tangents. It's also worth mentioning that since this talk was originally done 3 years ago, there's a study come out that indicates that autistic people tend to accrue PTSD symptoms with the more trauma they go through, and that would be predicted by this model. So what that means is that these connections can be broken, and these cones can be broken as well, and that while they can form back together and you can form new peaks together, they're not going to be the same. They will become disjointed, and it can take time and effort to reconnect the points, but that requires opportunity to enter flow states, and opportunities to redevelop skills and to reconnect them. But obviously that's not always possible. So if a person experiences trauma over and over again, these connections can be broken. It can be difficult to reforge them. It's kind of what's important to note that a person's spike profile does change over time in different situations. But yeah, so talking about impact of trauma and development. So this process can be exacerbated by experience in distressing situations, and it's possible to internalize distressing responses. So it can create a destructive feedback loop, and the traumatic experience can shatter autistic person's fixed points. So the fixed points in our routines that we use to enter flow states, they can change due to resultant trauma, and it can force people to search for new activities to enter flow states in, and these new activities are not always beneficial or benign. They can be quite dangerous in some situations. So, for example, this is going from Harry Thompson's books. I'm using him as a bit of a case to kind of illustrate this point. So, if an autistic person is repeatedly traumatized, they can gradually shift from automatic responding to theirs to kind of control the food intake, which is example from Harry Thompson's book. So we can kind of our fixed points can retreat to to extreme activities as sources of fixed points, or we can for PDA, for example, if the fantasy role play pretend features can be explained by people kind of entering fantasy role play because they just can't find flow states on other activities, or they rarely or inconsistently find flow states from other activities. So if you're going into fantasy roleplay, and you enter a flow state in it, that can quite easily become a fixed point and internalize and become part of who they are, for example. So yeah, this practice goes over time, repeatedly entering a flow state by rituals. Sorry, this is an example. No, it's not. This is me still talking about this. So yeah, for example, if you controlling your food intake, that can become a fixed point over time, and it can explain why autistic people can develop eating disorders. So if you can't enter flow states regularly through other activities, but you do from controlling what food you eat, that can become a ritual, and then over time it can become part of who you are. And that's how kind of eating disorders can develop within autistic people, as explained by monotropism theory. But it also applies to kind of other extreme kind of fixed points and activities that people can engage in. But it's also important to explain, it's important as it explains why autistic people need to have environments where we can enter flow states easily and have many different sources of flow states. So we have many different fixed points that we can use because it helps protect us from, for example, developing eating disorders, for example. It's also important why the structure part of the spell framework by the National Autistic Society is that you build routines and structure points of our routines based on autistic person's preferences and wishes. Because generally autistic people do not respond well to having routines or fixed points enforced upon us. We tend to react quite badly to them. So yeah, just give me a minute. So this is an example from Judy Eaton's 2018 book, and it talks about kind of autistic people controlling their food intake. So often a person can go into meltdown kind of when pushed to follow other people's directions. So these people would be what Judy Eaton calls externalizers, and if a person's pushed to displaying kind of clear emotions or making mistakes, they can kind of internalize their anger and frustration. So this can prevent further kind of social isolation. A person can control their food intake or behavior instead of kind of controlling other people's is a way of kind of controlling their environment, and it's a way of kind of managing their anxiety level. So what it means is if you're controlling what food you can take in over time, you can I've already kind of described this process. I'm going to move on to the next slide. It can be relatively easy for an autistic infant to be startled by kind of trivial interactions with their caregivers. So it's kind of theorized in the monotropism theory that autistic infants will have a very inconsistent and a very partial picture of their external environment. I think you can argue from their internal environment, because when you're processing information sensory stimuli sequentially, it's going to be very difficult for an autistic infant to build a cohesive and accurate model of what's going on around them, especially the caregivers. So they might only, for example, if you're picking up an autistic infant and you're hugging them, they might go from perceiving part of your nose to part of your chin to your scent, and it can be in any random order from the infant's perspective. So that can be quite disorientating for an infant to kind of process, and that's why I'm saying it's relatively easy. It can be relatively easy to start an autistic infant just by interacting with them. Because what I'm trying to say is the infant may not recognise they're in a safe situation when being hugged, and this is shocked. They can happen repeatedly, and I would point this is not the caregiver's fault. It's just a byproduct of an infant having monotropic cognitive style and just a caregiver doing what caregivers expected to do. The startled infant can become hyper aware and sensitive to sensory become sensitive to the sensory environment. It kind of raises intolerance to uncertainty, less anxiety. Caregivers are just obviously told to follow standard parenting advice, which can obviously sometimes raises the mismatch between the environment and the infant. It generates a cycle that could deteriorate the infant's and or the caregiver's well-being. And I need to keep stressing this. If this cycle happens, it's often not the caregiver's fault, but can you explain why kind of PDA features are seen in some infants? I need to point out that the developmental aspects of PDA are not required for a PDA diagnosis, and the PDA features, the developmental features of PDA are generic in nature, so they're seen outside of PDA. So, yeah, it also explains why you need to have strategies that work with the child. Yeah, so they kind of fixed points tend to be can often be fancy role playing or other kind of challenging behaviour such as kind of automatically responding to theirs. The reason we'll say this is, for example, for Harry Thompson, he would point out that he would often react outrageously because it's one of the few ways in which he could reliably predict how other people would react. So over time, it just become part of who he is. Yeah, it can be problematic, kind of leading to a substantial mismatch between the autistic person and their environment, and can kind of lead to trauma. Just a way of pointing out, if you're often reacting outrageously to other people, that can kind of be quite off-putting to other people, or it can be quite anxiety-inducing to other people. So if you're consistently acting outrageously to other people, others around you are probably going to interact with you less frequently or quite atypically. So if you're one of these people who are acting particularly outrageous or kind of, I don't might sound problematically or quite atypically compared to people's perspectives, that will likely impact the quality and frequency of the social interactions that the person will be experiencing. That can kind of lead to kind of the person on PDA kind of developing kind of different atypical worldviews, I would point out, or non-consistent worldviews. So, yeah, monotropism theory basically views PDA and autistic people as traumatized autistic people. At least my version of it does, anyway. This is getting close into the sorts. This is just errors overlapped in the PDA literature and the trauma and or attachment-based literature. So it's stuff that like behaviorist / reinforcement-based strategies do not work. Like you need to build trust in relationships. Like chaotic worldviews and high anxiety are often present. Children kind of just taking rewards instead of completing requests. And like caregivers can be desperate for some explanation because traditional approaches just do not work. Yeah, there's a lack of pride or shame. That's literally a PDA behavior. So that's PDA diagnostic trait there. The need to reduce uncertainty. There's significant overlap between kind of trauma-based strategies and the PDA strategies. So that's kind of dialectical behavioral therapy (DBT) and low arousal approach. There's need for a key worker. The Howard model is applicable to trauma-based developmental delay and can explain PDA. I hypothesized that PDA is a trauma / distress response that's not specific to autistic people. So yeah, summarising, monotropism can explain anxiety and autism. There's a developmental model that places importance on matching environment to a child, and that autistic trauma is often not the caregiver's fault in this model. So I need to some acknowledgement. So I had quite a lot of feedback from other people as part of developing this logical progression of monotropism theory. So I'd like to thank Cole Cameron, Judy and Jonathan Green, Damien Milton, Diana Murray, and Harry Thompson. Diana Murray, who originally created monotropism theory, did review my logical progression of her work, and I would like to thank kind of Annie McDonald, Fergus Murray, and Katrin Stewart for having faith in my theorising. So, and also Luke Binner for his global instability theory that inspired my initial logical progression of monotropism work. Because I was originally trying to synthesize the global instability theory of monotropism theory, but then upon reflecting upon it, I realised that monotropism theory can explain Luke Binner's global instability theory. So, these are my contact details, which are still the same. So that's my email address, my Twitter handle, my research profile, which has basically my kind of my portfolio of research work. The discussion point, which is how a monotropism developmental model can explain the diagnostic criteria. So these are the core traits, or some of them. I tend to only use 5 of these now. I don't include the subsociability as a core one anymore. And these are the developmental traits. So yeah, you can pause them if you want to read them. There's about 17 slides with bibliography on there. I'm not going to linger on each slide for a particular long time because you can just pause the video to get hold of them if you want to. So yeah. Anyway, I hope you found it quite useful. I mean, I'm quite passionate about this monotropism work and on PDA. I think it's quite a powerful explanation. So I would say that considering it is my work. So me, I'll get into towards the end of the slides and the references. So yeah, I think the next one is the last one. Is like, I'll be there yet. So yeah, that's it. So thank you for watching this talk, and I hope you enjoyed it. And I hope you found it informative. And on that note, I'm going to stop this recording.